On September 22, 1979, U.S. satellite Vela Hotel 6911 detected something that sent alarms flaring through the Pentagon. One blinding flash of light, followed by another just as powerful. The pattern was unmistakable. It was the telltale sign of a nuclear explosion. But who would detonate a nuke right at the height of the Cold War without informing America? Was it the Soviets testing the line? Or had a new rogue player joined the nuclear club? The U.S. launched a massive, urgent investigation. The data was scary. The Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico confirmed an anomalous ionospheric wave consistent with a nuclear detonation. The pieces were coming together. And then the U.S. went silent. The Carter administration discarded the event as a simple atmospheric phenomenon. The satellite wasn't supposed to find anything that night. It was built with the hope it would never find anything. Vela 6911 had been circling Earth since 1970, a Cold War watchdog in geostationary orbit, its sensors trained on the planet below like an all-seeing eye. Its job was simple and terrifying in equal measure: catch nuclear cheaters. The Soviet Union had signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So had the US, the UK, and France. The treaty pushed all testing underground, away from the atmosphere, away from the oceans. Vela's job was to make sure everyone kept their word. At 12:52 a.m. on September 22, 1979, something in the South Atlantic did not. The satellite registered what physicists call a bang meter signature: 2 pulses of intense light separated by less than a second. The first pulse was the fireball, a flash so intense it outshone the sun for a fraction of a moment. Then darkness. The second pulse was longer and less intense as the shockwave tore upward and the superheated air began to glow again. That specific pattern, that precise rhythm of light, is the fingerprint of a nuclear explosion. Nothing else in nature produces it. Meteorites don't. Lightning doesn't. Not even electric storms. The bang meter had been calibrated across dozens of confirmed tests, and it had never misfired. The Pentagon jolted. Within hours, analysts were pulling data from every monitoring station the United States controlled. The Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico, then the largest radio telescope on Earth, confirmed what the satellite had seen. An anomalous ionospheric disturbance rippled across the upper atmosphere, the kind of wave that only a massive, sudden energy release produces. The Earth had absorbed a punch. A small one, but a punch nonetheless. Estimates put the yield at 2 to 3 kilotons. For context, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was around 15 kilotons. Whatever detonated in the South Atlantic on September 22nd was more of a proof of concept than a city killer. But it had nuclear written all over it. Somebody had crossed that threshold and done it quietly, in the dark, in one of the most remote stretches of ocean on the planet, right between South Africa and Antarctica. The first question was obvious. Who could have detonated such a device? The first wave of analysis pointed east. It pointed to Moscow. But why would they go all the way there to test a small nuclear weapon? Why over the sea? Were they testing a new anti-warship bomb? The Soviet Union had been pushing miniaturized warhead technology throughout the 1970s, trying to reduce the size and weight of its nuclear arsenal without sacrificing yield. A small test, conducted in a blind spot of the American surveillance net, fit the pattern. The South Atlantic was remote. The satellite coverage in that corridor was thin. If you wanted to sneak a test past the Americans, that stretch of gray ocean was close to the best place on Earth to do it. But the data kept returning a problem. 2 to 3 kilotons was not a Soviet signature. Even if they were testing a smaller yield tactical nuke, they had the largest territory on Earth to do it, and they'd never been shy about their tactical nuclear weapons program. The USSR had no reason to test something that small on the other side of the world. More importantly, their arsenal was already mature. Their warhead technology had been proven across hundreds of underground tests in Kazakhstan. A sub-kiloton range device, tested with such secrecy, made sense for a power developing miniaturization from scratch, not for a superpower that had been building hydrogen bombs since 1953 and brandishing them with pride to taunt Uncle Sam. The size was wrong. The location was wrong. The political context was wrong. But this raised an even more troubling question. If it wasn't the Soviets, then who? The U.S. Navy's Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, A classified network of underwater hydrophones strung across the ocean floor to track Soviet submarines picked up an acoustic signal in the South Atlantic, consistent with an underwater or near-surface detonation. The signal was faint, but it was there, and it placed the event in the ocean, not on land, not underground. Somebody had detonated something either in the water or just above it. That detail mattered enormously. Underground tests leave almost no atmospheric signature. They're designed to be invisible. But a surface or near-surface burst, that produces fallout. It kicks radioactive material into the atmosphere, and fallout travels through the air. Within weeks, researchers at the Naval Research Laboratory were analyzing thyroid samples from sheep grazing in Australia and Tasmania. They found elevated levels of iodine-131 in the animal's tissue. This is a radioactive isotope with a half-life of 8 days, produced almost exclusively by nuclear fission. The sheep had been breathing contaminated air. The plume had drifted east across the Southern Ocean and settled over the Australian outback, absorbed by grass, eaten by animals, concentrated in their thyroids. Iodine-131 does not come from solar flares or meteoroids. It comes from a nuclear detonation. The case was building itself, and it was pointing somewhere nobody in Washington wanted to look. Somewhere much closer than Russia. Geographically, South Africa made sense. It was close to the area where the flashes had been detected, and U.S. intelligence was aware that the African nation was pursuing a nuclear program. But that's as far as logic seemed to go. Yes, the apartheid government was known to be working on uranium enrichment at their Pelindaba facility, but most Western intelligence sources agreed that they were years away from actually miniaturizing a device, enough to turn it into a deliverable weapon. To make it even less plausible, experts doubted South Africa had the naval capability or the specialized aircraft required to conduct a secret, remote, overwater test thousands of miles from their coast during a massive storm. No. Whoever had done this not only had the experience to work through the storm, but had actually used it to try to mask the nuclear detonation. But the greatest piece of evidence against the theory that South Africa was the culprit was quite simple. They had absolutely no reason to do it. However, a closer look by the US revealed South Africa's increasingly clear motivation. The desperate nation saw developing a nuclear bomb as its only hope. Other nations were embarrassed or moving away from racial laws after the 1963 UN Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. South Africa had doubled down on its apartheid ideology, and in turn, the world had shunned it. This brought sanctions, boycotts, and zero international support, just when they desperately needed outside help. The map of Africa, all around the apartheid nation, was redrawing itself in communist red. Mozambique had fallen to Frelimo in 1975. Angola had fallen to the MPLA the same year. Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, was in the final throes of a guerrilla war that would end white minority rule by 1980. And then there were the Cubans. In November 1975, Cuba deployed combat troops to Angola at the request of the MPLA government. By 1979, somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 Cuban soldiers were operating in Angolan territory, many of them stationed near the Namibian border, which South Africa controlled. South African Defense Force units were already conducting cross-border raids into Angola under Operation Savannah and its successors, trying to destroy SWAPO bases and push the Cubans back. The fighting was brutal and largely invisible to the outside world. The white minority government in Pretoria was fighting for the survival of a system the entire world wanted gone. Apartheid was theology, woven into the Afrikaner national identity, through decades of Dutch Reformed Church doctrine, through a historical narrative that cast white South Africans as a chosen people in a hostile land. A nuclear weapon was the ultimate insurance policy. South Africa possessed abundant uranium in the Witwatersrand Basin, one of the world's largest deposits. By the early 1970s, Pretoria was enriching uranium at the Pelindaba facility, and by the late 1970s, US intelligence assessed that they could build a fission device. The nuclear capability would prevent Soviet and Cuban forces from overrunning the northern borders, as neither would risk escalation. However, secrecy was vital. A public test would trigger strangling arms embargoes and force UN Security Council action. Even the US could not protect a nuclear-armed apartheid state. Consequently, any test had to remain undiscovered. The motivations were there. So was the uranium. But the means to carry out a secret test in the middle of the ocean, the device design, that had to come from somewhere else. Building a nuclear weapon requires more than enriched uranium. It requires precision engineering, sophisticated detonation systems, and the kind of institutional knowledge that only comes from serious, sustained weapon research programs. South Africa's nuclear program was real, but young. They lacked the experience and sophistication to miniaturize a nuclear device and keep it secret from Western intelligence. Something was not adding up here. The gap pointed toward Israel. By 1979, Israel's nuclear program was one of the world's worst-kept secrets. The country had never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. A French-built reactor at Dimona in the Negev Desert had been operating since the early 1960s, and the CIA had known for years that Israel was reprocessing plutonium. Former Israeli nuclear technician Mordecai Vanunu would later confirm in 1986 that Israel had produced dozens of nuclear devices. But in 1979, none of this was officially acknowledged. Israel was, like South Africa, operating under international isolation following the 1973 Yom Kippur War and the subsequent oil embargo. The two countries had maintained quiet diplomatic and trade ties throughout the 1970s, including cooperation on military hardware. South African uranium had reportedly flowed to Israel under informal arrangements. The relationship was functional, discreet, and mutually beneficial. The theory, supported by American, South African, and Israeli intelligence assessments that have since been partially declassified, runs as follows. Israel provided the miniaturized warhead design and possibly the detonation technology. South Africa provided the uranium, the remote test site, and the naval assets to position the device. The October 1979 flash, 2 to 3 kilotons, matches the yield profile of a small tactical device, exactly the kind of low-yield weapon Israel would want to validate without conducting a test on its own territory. The political implications for Washington were catastrophic. Jimmy Carter had staked a significant portion of his foreign policy credibility on nuclear non-proliferation. His administration had pressured South Africa on its nuclear ambitions, specifically extracting assurances in 1977 that Pretoria would not test a device. More critically, in September 1978, exactly 1 year before the flash, Carter had brokered the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. It was a signature achievement of his presidency. Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat shaking hands on the White House lawn was Carter's legacy. Confirming that Israel had conducted or participated in a rogue nuclear test would have meant sanctioning Israel. Sanctioning Israel would have torched Camp David. The Nobel Peace Prize winning agreement would have collapsed under the weight of a 2-kiloton detonation in the South Atlantic. Israel losing the support of the U.S. would mean war in the Middle East. The truth was a liability Carter could not afford to carry. And that's how one of the largest alleged cover-ups in modern history was born. The White House needed a way out. They found one in a committee. Frank Press, Carter's science advisor, assembled a panel of 9 experts in late 1979 to review the Vela data. The group was led by Jack Ruina, a respected MIT electrical engineer with a background in arms control. The Ruina panel, as it became known, spent several months reviewing the satellite data, the hydroacoustic readings, the ionospheric measurements, and the sheep thyroid results from Australia. They concluded that the band meter signal was probably not a nuclear explosion. Their alternative explanation was a zoo event, a simultaneous, extraordinarily unlikely combination of a meteoroid strike on the satellite sensor and a coincidental alignment with solar reflections that mimicked the nuclear double pulse signature. The panel placed the odds of this occurring as extremely low, but not impossible. They noted that Vela 6911 was aging, its sensors degraded after 9 years in orbit, and that the satellite had shown some anomalous readings in prior months. The Carter administration accepted the panel's conclusion with visible relief and announced that the event remained inconclusive. The Naval Research Laboratory disagreed. The NRL had been conducting its own independent analysis, and the zoo event hypothesis did not persuade its scientists. The band meter on Vela 6911 had 2 independent sensors, positioned to cross-check each other. Both registered the double pulse. The probability of a meteoroid strike simultaneously affecting both sensors in a manner that perfectly replicated a nuclear signature was, in the NRL's assessment, vanishingly small. Their internal report, classified at the time, and later released in a partially redacted form, concluded that an actual nuclear detonation was the most probable explanation for the data. Then there was the iodine-131. The ARENA panel essentially dismissed the sheep thyroid data, arguing that the levels found were not conclusively linked to the South Atlantic event and could have other explanations. This was, to put it charitably, a stretch, especially considering iodine-131's 8-day half-life. The elevated readings appeared in Australian livestock in the weeks immediately following September 22nd. The atmospheric modeling placed the drift pattern directly over the plume trajectory from the South Atlantic event. Radioactive iodine does not appear in sheep thyroids by coincidence. Los Alamos National Laboratory ran its own analysis and sided with the NRL. So did the Defense Intelligence Agency. The classified consensus inside the American intelligence community was not that the event was inconclusive. The classified consensus was that a nuclear detonation had occurred. The official White House position, based on the ARENA panel, ignored these findings. Carter would stick to the inconclusive account. So would all other presidents ever since. Decades later, the former head of South Africa's nuclear weapons program, Waldo Stumpf, gave interviews in which he neither confirmed nor denied the test, but acknowledged that South Africa had developed 6 gun-type fission devices by the late 1970s. South Africa eventually dismantled its entire nuclear arsenal in 1989 under President F.W. de Klerk, before handing power to the ANC. When they did so quietly, without ever having officially acknowledged what they built or where they tested it. The Vela incident is officially unresolved. The U.S. government's position, unchanged across 7 subsequent administrations, is that the 1979 event remains inconclusive. That position has not aged well. In 1994, the South African government began a limited disclosure process about its nuclear history. Documents released through that process confirmed that South Africa had a functioning nuclear weapons capability by 1979, and that it had seriously considered potential use scenarios against neighboring states. The declassified NSA and CIA documents that have surfaced through FOIA litigation over the past 30 years paint a consistent picture. American intelligence agencies believed a nuclear test occurred. The accepted inconclusive finding was a political decision. The geopolitical cost of the silence was specific and measurable. By declining to confirm the test, the Carter administration avoided a confrontation with Israel over the Camp David Accords. It avoided acknowledging the complete failure of its non-proliferation strategy in South Africa. But the silence also meant that no international pressure was brought to bear on Pretoria's nuclear program in the critical window between 1979 and 1989. South Africa spent that decade in a state of covert nuclear armament, running a weapons program that the world officially pretended did not exist, fighting a border war in Angola that cost tens of thousands of lives, maintaining an apartheid system that the UN had labeled a crime against humanity. The flash in the South Atlantic revealed the hierarchy of priorities that governed Western foreign policy in the Cold War. Apartheid was tolerable. Communist troops in Angola were not. Israeli nuclear weapons were a problem too dangerous to acknowledge. Non-proliferation was a principle the United States enforced selectively, against the weak and not strategically necessary. The incident was thoroughly suppressed, with all evidence eliminated, leaving only the faintest trace of radioactive fallout, detectable in the thyroids of Tasmanian cattle. Vela Hotel 6911 found exactly what it was looking for, a hidden thing, briefly made visible. The people who were supposed to act on what it found decided, after careful consideration, that they had not seen anything at all.